Hey YouTube, Joyboy here. So, let's talk about Gear 4th. And so guys, this has been a long time since I've talked about Gear 4th, and in fact, a long time ago I planned more videos on it, but a lot of things were happening in Whole Cake Island at the time. So rip, I guess, but here we are. And so, I need to cover some things that I've talked about in previous videos, just so that you understand my perspective. First of all, there are multiple forms of Gear 4th, as you should know. This was something that many people believed in and theorized all the way back when the first form, Bound Man or Bounce Man, was revealed, just because Luffy named it Gear 4th Bounce Man, which is something that he did not do for his previous gears, Gear 2nd and Gear 3rd. They didn't have little additions to their names, which kind of gave the impression that it was just there was other Gear 4th forms. And so that leads into Whole Cake Island and the reveal of Tankman. This for sure could end at Tankman. It could be that Gear 4th there was only two forms, Tankman and Bounce Man, but I tend to believe, or I'd like to believe, that there might be another form, and for sure, based on what I believe it to be and the various aspects which make Gear 4th unique and give it its powers, that Oda has creativity, he has room to add additional forms. And so what exactly is Gear 4th? And in simplest terms possible, Gear 4th is Luffy blowing into his muscles, which makes it different from Gear 3rd, which is him blowing into his bones, and Gear 2nd, which is him pumping his blood. I should also say that it's possible Gear 4th is Luffy simultaneously blowing into his muscles and bones, but it's not really worthy of getting into, I don't believe. And so because Luffy's body is clearly not normal, it's not human, he can move the air around inside of his body once he blows it into his arm. And using this, and probably in combination with Haki, he can put the air pretty much wherever he likes. For Bounce Man, the air seems to be pretty much evenly distributed throughout his body for the most part. There's probably a little bit less in his legs. I'm not sure if that's just how Oda likes to draw characters with, who are really buff but have skipped leg day. But regardless, I believe that Bounce Man is really just balanced in terms of placement of air. But this is in a stark contrast to Tankman, where Luffy centers this air in his belly. And so it's also important when considering Gear 4th is Haki. I believe that without Haki, Gear 4th would not exist. And for sure, the placement of the Haki is important for Luffy achieving what he wants to with that form. Because as he revealed, or as Doflamingo revealed in the Dressrosa arc, when Luffy coats his buffed up muscles in Haki, they become super elastic. Or in layman's terms, they become more bouncy, more rubbery. And this allows Luffy to do some crazy things, but in general just improves his strength and his speed, does all sorts of great things for him. And so, in Tankman, Luffy centered his Haki around his belly and his torso. Very much different to how the Haki was placed in Bounce Man, because Tankman is a defensive form. But in Bounce Man, the Haki was mainly placed around his arms and back and legs. And we've seen how Luffy utilizes Bounce Man, so this is clearly for offensive purposes, that Bounce Man compared to Tankman is his attack form. But just as a little fun fact, the reason that Bounce Man is called Bounce Man is because he bounces around. But you'll notice that Tankman doesn't bounce, and the reason is because in Tankman, Luffy does not cover his feet in Haki. And keeping in mind that Haki makes his rubbered body plus the air extremely bouncy, then he didn't cover his feet in Haki, therefore Tankman doesn't bounce. So anyway guys, if you're going to speculate on alternative forms of Gear 4th, yet to be revealed forms, then you would focus specifically on these two things that make it unique, or the various forms unique. Where the air is, and the placement of the Haki. And usually these would be combined. You would put more air in the areas that you plan on covering with Haki to utilize whatever advantages that combination could grant you. So let's start off with the extremely obvious one. I think the one that, if anyone has put any thought to it whatsoever, they've come up with, and one that I find to be extremely viable, which would be something like Jumpman. And so guys, the idea behind Jumpman is simply put that in Bounce Man, the air in Luffy's body is pretty much evenly distributed. If you could even go so far as to say that he perhaps puts more air into his upper body than his lower body. And in Tankman, he completely ignores his legs. But if he put a bunch of air into his legs and coated them with the vast majority of his haki, seriously guys, no fence or wall in the entire world would be able to stop him. But here I want to address an important point, which is that I think it's very obvious that Luffy's go-to form in Gear 4th is definitely Bounce Man, and I think that's because Bounce Man is the best for combat, whereas Tank Man has a very niche use. I would suspect that if Luffy has already come up with alternative forms of Gear 4th aside from these two, that they would also be of the niche variety, that they would only be used in the circumstances that they would be useful. And this would definitely be the case if Jumpman came into existence. The purpose of Jumpman, if Luffy ever used it, is to just jump to perhaps his highest speed form, to get to one place to another as fast as possible, perhaps to escape, perhaps to save people. We don't know exactly how, but this is really, I see what the utility for this form would be. The circumstances that I'm sort of imagining is like in Dressrosa, where Orlumbus threw Zoro at Pika. This is basically what Zoro needed to do, is he needed to get over there to save the Straw Hats and Riku and everyone else, and he couldn't do that without help. And so with a form like this, Luffy could be able to accomplish a very similar feat. No pun intended. But yeah, when Luffy wants to fight, he'll go Bound Man. When Luffy wants to defend, he'll go Tank Man. And when Luffy wants to run and is in a situation where it will be useful to, then he should go Jumpman. Now, with the current events that are happening in the Tea Party, you might think that this would have been a good time to use it, but keeping in mind with King Bomb and everyone else that was there, it's possible that Luffy just wouldn't be able to take everyone like that. It's also worth pointing out that Luffy was actually planning on doing something for his Big Mom, but Nami specifically stopped him. This could possibly be another form of Gear 4th that was specifically designed to perhaps run, or move so quickly that he could intervene and stop Big Mom from killing everyone. Or maybe Oda's saving it for another occasion, or maybe it just straight will never exist. We can't know. It's also possible that with a form like this, Luffy's kicks could be incredibly powerful. So I'm not suggesting that it has no firepower whatsoever. Even something like Tank Man, which is not designed to attack anyone, still has attack capabilities. Cracker knows. Despite this being incredibly easy to speculate, I do think that it is probably the most likely alternative form that could exist. A lot of people like to say, well, Oda is more creative than that. But even something like Tank Man is fairly obvious when looking in hindsight, right? You have, once you speculated multiple forms, you have Bounce Man, which is sort of balanced attack. Then you're like, well, it would make sense for Luffy to have a defensive form, and he could potentially change the placement of air and put the haki over his belly to make his belly super springy and defend himself. And lo and behold, so despite this being obvious, I do think it has a lot of potential. But now I want to draw your attention to King Kong Gun. And so King Kong Gun is interesting because Luffy blows additional air into his muscles, and he moves this additional air into one arm for a Mega Punch. Now King Kong Gun is not an additional form of Gear 4th, but it does offer up some possibility for a future form, which is what I find interesting about it is he can control the placement of the air separate within his body. So, for example, in Bounce Man, the air is evenly distributed throughout his body. In Tank Man, he puts the air in his belly. But while in Bounce Man using King Kong Gun, he has air spread out throughout his body, and then a pocket of air in his fist. So the reason that this is different is in all previous instances, the air was in some way connected. All the air is sort of in his upper body, torso, and belly. All the air is throughout his body, but perhaps it's possible for Luffy to separate the air that he blows into his body so that he could put some of that air in his upper body and his arms, and some of that air in his lower body and his legs, and not put any air at all or very little air into his stomach. This could be called something like Gear 4th Strike Man. And the reason why it would have usefulness as compared to his other forms is that in Bounce Man, he has some form of defense. That when he blows air into his muscles, they become more elastic, and then he can sort of in very small ways shift his haki to protect his belly. But in a situation where the air is exclusively in his limbs that are used for attack, then he wouldn't be protecting his body at all. It would be the pure attack form. And being a pure attack form, then obviously using it would have some risk. It's also possible that by sort of separating the air within his body, that this form perhaps taxes him even more than Bounceman. But yeah guys, I'm sure that there's many other very small possibilities on how Luffy could manipulate it, but it's really straightforward. And I don't find this theory or this topic to be overly mind-blowing once you just understand how it works. Luffy can manipulate the placement of the air and the placement of the haki. It is as simple as that. So when you're speculating on a potential additional form of Gear 4th, then these are the two variables. But as I speculated a very long time ago, I believe that the haki is important to allowing for the existence of Gear 4th. Why did Luffy never think to blow air into his muscles pre-time skip? The reason that I don't think that he ever did was because he couldn't do it. That without haki, Gear 4th isn't possible. The haki, I guess, would keep the air in its place and keep it from just blowing out of his body. I think it's very important that when he goes in Gear 4th, there are little puffs of air that happen all the time around him. I think this is the air slowly escaping. And you can see when the haki turns off, all of the air blows out of his mouth. I think that pre-time skip, if Luffy had attempted something like that, what would happen would be he would instantly lose the form. And the reason that he, it also makes sense because the huge tax of Gear 4th is his haki. He has to use his haki to such an extent that it drains him so that he can't use it again for several minutes afterwards. And lastly, when Luffy did use King Kong Gun, he blew more air into his body. But before he did that, he changed the placement of the haki on his body. It covered more of him. I think he was using his haki to the absolute max. And I think the reason that he did this is because of the air within his body required more control. So anyway guys, haki is really the cornerstone of Gear 4th. It is the huge limitation that prevents Luffy from perfecting it. And I think that in the future of the story, it's also possible for Luffy to create a form of Gear 4th that can shift the air around freely because he can cover his entire body in haki. Or even if he doesn't need to exactly cover his entire body, he could better shift the placement of the haki on his body, better control it, so that he can shift between various forms, such as starting off in Bounceman and then mid-fight switch to Tankman. And with more and stronger haki, he could then put more air into his body and be able to keep it there. So something like Giant Luffy is a real possibility. And remember guys, the bigger Luffy gets, the more damage he is able to deal. This would be a huge power buff. And obviously with more haki and stronger haki than something like Bounceman, his current form, he would be able to maintain for a much longer time. And the last thing guys, before I end this video, is that it's very clear that Luffy is taxed more, the more air that is within his muscles. And so then it would follow that if there was less air, then it taxes him less. This is the difference between King Kong Gun and Bounceman. King Kong Gun, I believe, has a much shorter duration. Luffy can only hold that form for a smaller time than Bounceman. So if he blew less air into his body in general, if you take the idea behind Bounceman, but you just make it so that the starting off point is even less, then Luffy would not be as strong, but starting right away, he could maintain that form for longer. This may never happen, but I find it to be theoretically possible given the correct circumstances to use it. But anyway guys, that's all I really wanted to talk about today. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you have any interesting ideas that perhaps I didn't cover here, or perhaps found something wrong that I said. Just let me know. Like the video if you liked the video, dislike the video if you disliked the video, subscribe if you want to be notified for my future content, and as always guys, have a wonderful day.